There's a weapon system that could have ended America's longest war before it really began. A technology that would turn dense jungle from an impenetrable fortress into a shooting gallery. It's called the modern attack helicopter. And if the U.S. had deployed just 50 Apache helicopters in 1965 instead of the primitive Hueys they actually used, the Vietnam War wouldn't have lasted 10 years. It would have been over in weeks. In 1965, a U.S. Army AH-64 Huey helicopter dropped soldiers into the Huey Drang Valley for the first major battle of the Vietnam War. The Huey flew at 120 miles per hour with no armor and two door-mounted machine guns operated by hand. North Vietnamese forces shot down 5 helicopters in the first hour. The pilots couldn't see the enemy through the jungle canopy. They couldn't return effective fire. They were flying targets delivering troops into ambushes they couldn't prevent. In 1968, during the Tet Offensive, Viet Cong fighters hid in buildings and tunnels throughout Saigon. U.S. helicopters circled overhead, trying to spot enemy positions. The enemy was 20 feet below them, invisible in the urban terrain. American troops fought building to building for weeks because their helicopters couldn't identify targets they couldn't see with the naked eye. In 1972, North Vietnamese forces invaded South Vietnam with 200,000 troops and hundreds of tanks. U.S. helicopters attacked with rockets and machine guns, but they had to fly low and slow to aim, making them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. The North Vietnamese shot down dozens of helicopters because 1970s technology required pilots to see targets visually and attack from ranges where enemy guns could shoot back. But here's what should blow your mind about modern military technology. An Apache helicopter today would look at those same scenarios and dominate so completely it would seem like science fiction to a 1960s soldier. See-through jungle canopy with thermal imaging? Done. Identify enemies in tunnels with ground-penetrating radar? Easy. Destroy tanks from 4 miles away while flying behind a mountain. That's literally what they're designed to do. This is exactly how 50 modern Apache helicopters would have ended the Vietnam War in weeks. Why the technology gap between 1965 and 2025 is so extreme that it's not even a fair fight. And why every tactical problem that made Vietnam unwinnable becomes trivially easy with equipment that didn't exist 60 years ago. Let me explain why Vietnam was such a nightmare. They won almost every major engagement. The problem was finding the enemy in the first place. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were masters of concealment. They hid in triple canopy jungle so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. They built tunnel systems 20 feet underground. They moved at night. They wore civilian clothes. They disappeared into villages. American forces had overwhelming firepower, but no way to find targets. Here's what 1960s helicopter reconnaissance looked like. A pilot flying a Huey at 1,000 feet. Looking down with his eyeballs, trying to spot enemy forces under jungle canopy. That's it. That was the technology. If you couldn't see it with your eyes, it didn't exist. And in Vietnam's terrain, you couldn't see anything. The U.S. dropped millions of tons of bombs. We had more firepower than any military in history. But if you don't know where the enemy is, firepower is useless. You're just blowing up empty jungle while the enemy hides and waits for you to leave. A modern Apache helicopter makes this problem completely obsolete. And I'm about to show you exactly how. You see the problem Vietnam soldiers faced. They were fighting with equipment that required visual contact. The enemy specialized in being invisible. Modern Apaches would just turn on thermal imaging and see every warm body through the jungle canopy in perfect detail. The entire Viet Cong strategy of hide in the jungle becomes worthless. How Apaches would dismantle the Viet Cong in weeks. Okay. Let's run through the actual war and show you how modern helicopters would solve every problem that took years to deal with. Problem 1. The Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was how North Vietnam supplied their forces in the south. Thousands of soldiers and tons of supplies moved down jungle paths from North to South Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia. The U.S. bombed it constantly for years. Didn't work. The Vietnamese just rebuilt the paths overnight and kept moving supplies. Why didn't bombing work? Because 1960s aircraft couldn't see individual soldiers in triple canopy jungle. They bombed areas where they thought the trail was. Most bombs hit empty jungle. Here's what an Apache does to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It flies at night with thermal imaging turned on. It sees every person, every vehicle, every warm body moving through the jungle. The soldiers can't hide. Their body heat shows up bright white on thermal sensors through any amount of vegetation. Now the Apache hovers 4 miles away, completely safe from ground fire, and launches Hellfire missiles. One missile, one truck. One missile, one weapons cache. One missile, one supply depot. The Vietnamese can't shoot back because the helicopter is 4 miles away behind terrain. They can't hide because thermal imaging sees them anyway. Time to completely shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail with 50 Apaches. Every supply convoy destroyed. Every cache identified and hit. North Vietnam can't resupply their forces in the south. The war is already half over. Problem 2. Jungle ambushes. The Viet Cong's primary tactic was ambushing American patrols. Set up in the jungle, wait for U.S. troops to walk past, open fire from concealment, then disappear. Americans couldn't see them to shoot back effectively. Casualties were devastating. 1960s, helicopters couldn't prevent this. They'd fly overhead but couldn't see through the jungle to spot ambushes before they happened. Here's what an Apache does. It flies ahead of the patrol with its millimeter wave radar and thermal imaging active. It identifies every person within 3 miles. It differentiates between friendly forces and hostile forces by heat signature patterns and movement. It spots the ambush setup before American troops walk into it. Now the Apache marks the enemy positions, provides real-time targeting data to the ground troops, and drops 30 mm cannon fire on the ambush site. The Viet Cong hiding in the jungle get hit with explosive rounds before they can fire a shot. The American patrol walks through without a casualty. Time to make jungle ambushes impossible. Immediate. The moment Apaches start flying patrol routes, ambushes stop working. The Viet Cong's primary tactical advantage disappears. Problem 3. Tunnel systems. The Viet Cong built massive tunnel networks, hundreds of miles of underground passages where they hid from bombing, stored supplies, and planned operations. U.S. forces discovered these by accident and had to send soldiers into the tunnels to clear them. It was brutal, dangerous, close-quarters combat in total darkness. 1960s helicopters were useless against tunnels. You can't shoot what's underground. Here's what modern Apaches do with ground-penetrating radar. Map the underground network and mark every entrance and ventilation shaft. Then they call in bunker-buster munitions that collapse the entire tunnel system. Or they pump thermobaric weapons into the entrance. These explosives suck all oxygen out of the tunnels and kill everyone inside without a single soldier entering. Time to neutralize the tunnel networks. 1 month. Systematic mapping and destruction of every major tunnel complex. Viet Cong lose their safe havens. Problem 4. Night operations. Americans couldn't see in darkness. The enemy would attack at night when U.S. forces were blind and helpless. Night was when the Viet Cong moved supplies, repositioned forces, and launched attacks. 1960s, helicopters couldn't fly effective combat operations at night. No night vision technology existed that was worth anything. Here's what Apaches do at night. They turn on thermal imaging and radar. Night becomes better than daytime for them because thermal signatures show up more clearly when the sun isn't creating heat interference. The Apache sees everything. The enemy can't hide. Night stops being the enemy's advantage. It becomes America's advantage. Viet Cong troops moving at night show up like flashlights on thermal imaging. Apaches hunt them systematically, Every nighttime operation gets interdicted. Every troop movement gets destroyed. Time to take away the night. Immediately. First night patrol with Apaches operating. The Viet Cong realize darkness doesn't protect them anymore. You might be thinking, okay, but wouldn't the Viet Cong just adapt? Wouldn't they find ways to counter helicopters? Here's the thing, they tried. They shot down over 5,000 U.S. helicopters during the actual war. But those were primitive Hueys that had to fly low and slow and close to the enemy. They were vulnerable. Modern Apaches changed the equation completely. They engage from ranges where enemy weapons can't reach. A Hellfire missile has a 4-mile range. The heaviest machine gun the Viet Cong had was effective to maybe 1,500 yards. The Apache kills you from distances where you can't shoot back. Surface-to-air missiles? The Viet Cong didn't have them in 1965. North Vietnam got Soviet SAMs later in the war, but even those struggle against modern helicopters with countermeasures. Terrain masking and standoff ranges. The technological gap is just too extreme. It's like asking, could medieval knights defend against machine guns? The answer is no. So why didn't the U.S. develop Apaches in the 1960s? They tried. The AH-64 Cheyenne was an attack helicopter program that got canceled in 1972 due to cost overruns and technical problems. The technology they needed, thermal imaging, advanced targeting systems, fire-and-forget missiles, didn't exist in reliable form yet. They were building 1970s helicopters in a 1970s war. By the time the Apache was fielded in 1984, Vietnam was ancient history. But that Apache represented capabilities that would have ended the war decades earlier if the technology had existed. Let's run the actual timeline of how 50 Apaches deployed in 1965 end the Vietnam War. Week 1-2, reconnaissance and mapping. The 50 Apaches fly systematic patrols over South Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. They map every Viet Cong base, every weapons cache, every tunnel entrance, every supply route. Thermal imaging and radar identify thousands of targets that remained hidden for years in the actual war. By the end of Week 2, U.S. forces have a complete intelligence picture of enemy positions. Week 3-4, systematic destruction of infrastructure. Apaches hit the Ho Chi Minh Trail hard. Every supply convoy, every depot, every staging area gets hit with Hellfire missiles. The trail goes from moving hundreds of tons of supplies per week to moving nothing. North Vietnam's ability to supply forces in the south collapses. Simultaneously, Apaches identify and destroy major tunnel networks and base areas. The Viet Cong's safe havens cease to exist. Week 5. Niverne 6, interdiction of all movement with thermal imaging operating 24/7. Every attempt by Viet Cong forces to move or regroup gets spotted and destroyed. They can't concentrate forces. They can't resupply. They can't coordinate operations. They're scattered and isolated. Night operations by the enemy stop completely because Apaches hunt at night better than during the day. Week 7-8. Collapse of organized resistance. Viet Cong forces in the south, cut off from supply and unable to coordinate, fragment, and either surrender or flee to Cambodia. North Vietnamese forces can't push south because the Ho Chi Minh Trail is a death trap. The insurgency doesn't die completely. Some fighters hide in villages and continue guerrilla operations. But organized military operations end as shiven. Total time from Apache deployment to effective end of major combat operations. Why this is a thought experiment, not a guarantee. Look, I need to be honest. War is complicated. Technology isn't a magic wand. Even with 50 Apaches, the U.S. still faces political problems, public opinion issues, and the question of what happens after the shooting stops. Apaches would absolutely dominate the tactical military situation. But Vietnam was lost politically more than militarily. Even if we'd won every battle faster and with fewer casualties, the fundamental question remained, why are we here? What are we trying to accomplish? Is it worth it? But here's what we can say with confidence. The tactical problems that made Vietnam brutal and prolonged Minzivital enemies, jungle concealment, night operations, supply interdiction, would have been solved by modern attack helicopter technology. The war would have been shorter. American casualties would have been dramatically lower. The military outcome would have been decisive. Whether that would have made it a victory in any meaningful sense is a different question. But the fighting would have ended in weeks instead of years. That much is clear. Here's what this thought experiment really shows. Military technology advanced so dramatically between 1965 and today that conflicts that took years then could be resolved in weeks now. The capability gap is staggering. Night vision turns darkness from enemy advantage to American advantage. Thermal imaging makes jungle concealment worthless. Long-range missiles make return fire impossible. Armor makes helicopters survivable. Radar makes ambushes visible before they happen. The Vietnam War lasted 10 years and killed 58,000 Americans because we were fighting with technology that couldn't solve the fundamental problem, finding an enemy who specialized in being invisible. Modern technology solves that problem completely, irreversibly. The tactics that made the Viet Cong effective in 1965 would be suicide in 2025. Could 50 modern Apaches have won the Vietnam War in weeks? The tactical answer is yes. Absolutely. Without question, the technology gap is too extreme. The enemy's advantages evaporate. The conflict becomes one-sided. The political answer is more complicated. But the fighting, that ends fast, decisively, brutally. Because when one side can see everything and the other side's strategy is based on being invisible, there's only one possible outcome. Not years,